T-minus 90 seconds and counting. All systems are go. We're about 90 seconds from the launch of Space Shuttle Discovery.
Space exploration has always fascinated us, but it's not all adventure and discovery. Out there, far from Earth, astronauts have faced moments of terror and left behind terrifying last words.
That music even sounds outer spacey, doesn't it? You hear that? That whistling sound? Yeah. Woo! Look at your... Yeah, it sounds like, outer space type music.
Some stories are chilling, some heartbreaking, and others complete mysteries. Here are the top 10 most terrifying things astronauts have ever said in space. Words that remind us how cruel space can be. What were these last words, spoken in their most desperate moments? The mysterious knocking. Space has mysteries, but what if you were floating out there and suddenly heard knocking? That's precisely what happened to Long Yui, the first Chinese astronaut to orbit Earth in 2003. Imagine being alone, thousands of miles from any life on Earth, only to hear a terrifying banging outside your spacecraft. Lang described it as if someone or something was hitting a metal bucket with a hammer. Now that's enough to make even the bravest among us a little nervous, right? What's really strange is that Lang wasn't alone in this experience. He reported that the mysterious knocking continued for several minutes, coming and going unpredictably. And get this, a few other astronauts have also reported hearing similar sounds. The source? Nobody knows. Some say it could be the sound of the spaceship expanding and contracting with temperature changes, but others aren't so sure. Could there be more to it? Naturally, space agencies took note, but no clear explanation has ever emerged. The sounds seem to happen randomly, always catching astronauts off guard. Lang himself admitted that, despite all his training, he couldn't find a logical reason for it. He even tried to recreate the sound back on Earth, but couldn't match it. Was it a hallucination, a glitch, or maybe something else roaming out there? After hearing this story, we have some serious questions. Is space as empty as we think? And if not, who or what might be out there? Could these sounds be connected to other strange things astronauts have experienced in the vast black sky? The SOS messages. Imagine sitting by an old radio when suddenly faint. Desperate voices crackle through voices that shouldn't be there, pleading for help. This eerie moment happened to two Italian brothers, Achille and Giovanni Battista Giudica Cordelia, in the late 1950s. These brothers were radio enthusiasts who turned an abandoned German bunker near Turin into their own listening station. There, they claimed to pick up strange messages from space, not regular broadcasts, but haunting last words from Russian cosmonauts, stranded with no way out. One of the most haunting messages they intercepted came from a female cosmonaut in 1961. Her voice was panicked, filled with fear as she cried, "Conditions are getting worse. Why don't you answer? We are going slower. The world will never know about us." She seemed to know that her life was ending, and her final moments were filled with frustration and despair. The brothers could only listen as her voice faded into silence, leaving behind a mystery that still chills listeners. Now here's the twist. The Soviet government never officially acknowledged these failed missions. Back then, secrecy was paramount, especially during the Cold War, and any disaster in space was often kept under wraps. This secrecy left room for countless rumors, and skeptics questioned whether the Giudica Cordelia brothers really intercepted these distress calls or if it was all a hoax. But to this day, the recordings exist, and many believe they're genuine, a window into the terrifying moments experienced by the earliest space explorers. As unsettling as these recordings are, they also leave us with some big questions. What really happened to those lost cosmonauts? And if these messages are actual, how many more distress calls from space might be out there waiting to be discovered? After hearing these recordings, you may once think, just how dangerous is it out there? And what terrifying words might the next astronaut leave behind? The heat in my capsule is rising. You've killed me. Vladimir Karov was brave, but even the most courageous can feel fear, especially when they're falling to Earth in a doomed spacecraft. In 1967, Komarov boarded Soyuz 1, a Soviet spacecraft meant to be a milestone for the Soviet space program. However, from the start, the mission suffered from technical issues. Komarov knew Soyuz 1 had severe flaws and reportedly told his friends that the spacecraft was not ready. But under immense pressure, he went forward with the mission, knowing deep down it might be his last. As he began his descent, things went from bad to worse. The parachutes designed to slow the capsule's fall failed to open. Imagine his horror watching Earth grow larger by the second, knowing there was no way to stop what was coming. His final words, picked up by the American space station, were filled with anger and heartbreak. He was screaming, "The heat in my capsule is rising! You've killed me!" Those who heard his last transmission felt his sense of betrayal, not only by the Soviet system, but by the people who had pushed him into a mission he had doubted. The Soviet government remained silent about Komarov's tragic end, as always, keeping his story hidden from the world for years. Officially, they hailed him as a hero, but they never publicly admitted the faults in the mission. Komarov's death was a harsh reminder of the extreme dangers and sacrifices faced by early space explorers. He knew the risks, yet he felt compelled to do his duty, and that sense of betrayal makes his story so haunting. So how many other secrets might space agencies be hiding? And what about the other astronauts who have faced these terrifying moments alone? I hope we make it back. Michael Collins is often the forgotten astronaut of Apollo 11. While Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became legends for their first steps on the moon, Collins had a different, less glamorous role. He stayed behind in the command module, orbiting the moon alone while his crewmates made history. Imagine that, floating in space completely isolated, with only the silence of the void and the glow of Earth in the distance. He was thousands of miles from anyone, drifting in an unimaginable quiet. As he orbited the moon, there was a point in his journey when he was entirely out of contact with Earth. No radio, no chatter from mission control, just absolute silence. Collins later described this experience as peaceful and terrifying, a rare kind of loneliness few can imagine. For a moment, he was the most isolated human being in the universe. And it was in this loneliness that he thought, "I hope we make it back." Those words, so simple yet so haunting, capture the intensity of that moment. Imagine how desperate he may be. Collins admitted that he was haunted by the idea that something might go wrong with the landing or the return journey. If it did, he would be left alone, orbiting the moon, forever waiting for a rescue that might never come. He'd have been the only person to ever witness the moon landing, from the saddest vantage point possible. Thankfully, Armstrong and Aldrin returned, and Collins piloted them all safely back to Earth. But that isolation and his fear of being stranded remain unforgettable parts of his journey. You see, what was it like to feel entirely alone, yet in a place so vast and full of mysteries? And what about those who heard mysterious sounds coming from their spacecraft instead of silence? Let's move forward and see the strange noises that haunted astronauts in the depths of space. Fire in the cabin. Apollo 1 was supposed to be a routine test. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were strapped in the cabin and running through the pre-launch checklist. It was January 27, 1967, and everything seemed to go according to plan. But suddenly, an electric spark ignited the pure oxygen inside the capsule. In an instant, the cabin turned into a blazing inferno. The astronauts had barely any time to react. All they could do was shout out a desperate warning. Gus Grissom's voice emerged through the radio. "Fire in the cabin!" Those would be his final words.
Hey! Oh, no, fire in the cockpit! Buzz, can you read us? Can you get him out of there?
The fire spread so quickly that within seconds, the crew was trapped in dense, toxic smoke, struggling to breathe. Their spacesuits, designed to withstand the vacuum of space, couldn't protect them from the intense heat inside. In a heartbreaking twist, the equipment that was supposed to save them had turned against them. To make things worse, the cabin door was nearly impossible to open quickly. Engineers had designed it to open inward, assuming this would prevent accidental openings in space. But in that very moment, it became a tragic flaw. The crew inside couldn't escape, and rescuers outside couldn't get in. All anyone could do was listen helplessly to the last moments of these brave men. This terrible accident shocked NASA to its core. It forced them to redesign the spacecraft and completely prioritize safety. The Apollo 1 tragedy became a haunting story about how space exploration isn't just about reaching new limits, it's also about facing unexpected dangers. While Apollo 1 ended in tragedy, it paved the way for future missions to the moon and beyond. But with the memory of the fire still fresh, what about the astronauts who survived re-entry only to face new terrifying challenges? Now let's see the chilling story of an astronaut who felt the heat of re-entry in more ways than one. The cosmic music of Apollo 10. Space is silent, or so they say. But in May 1969, the Apollo 10 crew experienced something that still puzzles scientists and space enthusiasts alike. Astronauts Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan were orbiting the moon, rehearsing maneuvers that would prepare for the Apollo 11 moon landing. Everything was going smoothly until they passed to the moon's dark side. Out there, cut off from all communication with Earth, they heard something strange, an eerie, unexplainable sound that seemed to fill the void. It sounded like music.
That music even sounds outer spacey, doesn't it? You hear that? That whistling sound? Yeah. Woo! Look at your... Yeah, it sounds like, outer space type music. Hey, Tom, is your insulation all burned off here on the front side of your window over here? Right? Yeah.
The astronauts described it as whistling, or outer spacey music. At first, they laughed it off, thinking it was just a glitch or some kind of interference. But as the sound continued, they grew quiet, realizing they couldn't explain it. "Do you hear that whistling sound too?" one of them asked. It wasn't just a passing noise. It stayed with them, hanging in the background as they orbited the moon. Imagine being out there, thousands of miles from home, hearing a sound that shouldn't exist in the vacuum of space. But you know what the most disturbing part is? They debated whether or not they should even tell NASA. After all, who would believe it? They worried they'd be laughed off or labeled as superstitious, maybe even distracted. The mystery of the music was only revealed years later when NASA declassified the Apollo 10 transcripts. To this day, there's no definitive answer for what caused the sounds. Was it radio interference, an equipment malfunction, or perhaps something even more mysterious? As intriguing as it is, the cosmic music of Apollo 10 reminds us that there are still mysteries that we may never solve. So could it be that these strange sounds were more than just technical quirks? And if there's music in space, what else might be out there, waiting to be heard? We keep going to explore these mysteries and meet an astronaut who faces a different kind of crisis, one that almost cost him his life. I Think I've Been Hit. Luca Parmitano, an Italian astronaut, went on what seemed like a standard spacewalk in July 2013. But what began as a routine mission quickly turned into a nightmare. As Parmitano floated outside the International Space Station, he suddenly felt something odd inside his helmet. At first, he thought it was sweat or condensation, maybe just the usual discomfort that comes with working in a suit in the harsh vacuum of space. But within moments, he realized something far worse was happening. Water was steadily filling his helmet, and it wasn't stopping. Parmitano tried to keep calm, thinking it was a minor issue, but the water kept coming, making it hard for him to breathe or even see. He radioed back to mission control, struggling to stay composed, and said, "I think I've been hit." But it wasn't an impact. It was a terrifying leak that was now threatening his life. See yourself being high above Earth, trying to get to safety, while water rises around your nose and mouth. Parmitano was, quite literally, drowning in his helmet, trapped in a spacesuit that was supposed to protect him. The water blurred his vision, covered his ears, and began to enter his nose, making each second feel longer than the last. Space may be quiet, but Parmitano's mind must have been racing with thoughts of survival as he blindly made his way back to the airlock. Thankfully, Parmitano managed to return to the station, but the experience left him, and everyone watching, shaken. The issue was later traced back to a clogged water line in his suit's cooling system. NASA immediately reviewed and revised safety protocols to prevent something so terrifying from happening again. So while Luca's incident had a thankfully safe ending, it encourages us to think, how many other hidden dangers might astronauts face out there? And what happens when there's nowhere left to run? Now let's take a look at another space tragedy that highlighted just how risky it is to work beyond our atmosphere. We are burning up. In 1969, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Karov faced a terrifying end during his Soyuz 5 mission. During re-entry, an unexpected disaster happened. The spacecraft's heat shield, essential for protecting him from the searing heat of the atmosphere, failed. As he descended toward Earth, Mishin felt the heat rising inside the capsule, with temperatures climbing far beyond what humans should endure. As flames began to consume the spacecraft, Mishin sent out his last message, a desperate cry for help. His final words, "We are burning up," portrayed the unimaginable horror of being trapped in a spacecraft turning into a fiery inferno. The recording of this haunting transmission later spread widely, leaving a lasting impact on everyone who heard it. Mission's death was a sad story of just how little room there was for error in those early days of space exploration. In response to the tragedy, space agencies worldwide strengthened safety protocols, re-examining every detail of spacecraft re-entry systems. Mission's last words highlighted the true dangers of re-entry, a crucial moment in any mission where any flaw could mean catastrophe. The terrifying reality of Mission's experience leaves us with a question. How many of these hidden risks still occur in the missions of today's space explorers? Now let's shift from the intense heat of re-entry to another unsettling moment in space, when an astronaut's last message was a quiet admission that he might not make it back. Asteroids pinging against the ship. Space is vast and silent, but it's far from empty. Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield learned this firsthand when he experienced a series of tiny impacts while aboard the International Space Station. Hadfield would hear unclear pings and taps hitting the spacecraft's surface during his missions. At first, these noises might seem harmless, but those little sounds were actually meteoroids, tiny pieces of rock and metal moving faster than a bullet. Each ping was a reminder that, in space, even the smallest particles can be deadly. Hadfield once described how the station's solar panels were ruined with tiny holes from these meteoroid impacts. Every hit was proof of how exposed astronauts are, floating in a fragile metal shell in the vastness of space. Even though the ISS is equipped with shields to protect against this kind of damage, there's always the risk that a larger piece could break through, and in space, a single crack could lead to catastrophic decompression in seconds. You're in bed trying to fall asleep when you hear a soft knock on your window. And the fun part? That window is the only thing separating you from the dark outer space. For Hadfield and his crew, each ping was both familiar and terrifying, a small but constant reminder of the hostile environment surrounding them. These encounters with space are part of astronauts' everyday reality. But the risks are not just from tiny meteoroids. Space is filled with everything from small particles to larger chunks of old satellites, all moving at incredible speeds. With Hadfield's stories in mind, we're left with a question. How do astronauts handle the fear of an impact that could come at any moment? And what if the next threat they face isn't just from space debris, but something even more mysterious? And there are not only tiny pebbles and rocks, but space also has something more unexpected, like snakes. Number 1, space snakes. Not all mysteries in space come from technical glitches or cosmic dangers. In 1994, astronaut Story Musgrave reported seeing something completely unexpected and quite offbeat. While on one of his 6 space missions, Musgrave claimed he encountered what he described as space snakes. According to him, these creatures were 6 to 8 feet long, crawling alongside his spacecraft, seemingly following him through the vastness of space. Musgrave, a highly respected astronaut, doctor, and mathematician, wasn't one to indulge in wild fantasies. Yet he stood by his account, insisting he saw these snake-like objects not just once, but on 2 separate missions. This odd encounter started debates, with some saying it was an illusion caused by debris or an optical phenomenon. Others, however, entertained the idea that he had truly glimpsed something unknown. Was it a hallucination or an actual encounter with life beyond Earth? Story Musgrave's space snakes remain one of space's most curious and unexplained sightings, adding a strange concept to the mysteries astronauts face beyond our atmosphere. Which of these things shook you the most? Do you think there are even more hidden stories from space? If you're as fascinated as we are, hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel to watch more stories from outer space. Thanks for watching.